On today's show, we have our guest, David Goa, and we're going to be talking about the Middle Ages and how do they deal with the homeless population in ancient times. We decided to do this video on this topic after a very interesting conversation. I realized working with the homeless population on a volunteer basis, a lot of them were traumatized in institutions. And this could be the reason they live a very nomadic lifestyle, because they prefer to live in tents, because they equate, this is just my theory, being in a building or an institution abusive or something to be afraid of. And if you listen to their stories, you can't really blame them for a lot of their behaviors. It actually starts to make a lot of sense when you start to listen to them.
Hmm.
But anyways, David Goa, tell me about these traveling monastics that they had in the Middle Ages. What are they called?
I think you're referring to mendicants.
Mendicants.
Yes, I mean it is so curious. Uh, every society and every period has its own gifts and also its own way of calling forth particular ways of living and of course marginalizing other ways of living. And in Edmonton, I mean, you've known a number of homeless people,
Yep.
and I've certainly known some as well, some that come to my door, um, some that I see down in the ravine here.
Yep.
Uh, I live close to a ravine, and it's interesting how occasionally there's a little tent encampment that's there. We have found, in a city like Edmonton and so many Canadian cities, this has become kind of a hard matter to resolve. And there is, as you no doubt know, there have been some initiatives by mayors and provinces, as well as the federal government, to provide housing for
Yes.
for people. And I suspect that in most of the cases where people have the opportunity to live in a house and establish a little more stability to their lives, they welcome that and do that. But what you have been talking about a bit is that small percentage of people for whom living within four walls or within an apartment building clicks off this trauma,
Yes.
which is associated with their childhood home, perhaps,
Mm-hmm.
or which may be associated with having been arrested and put in prison, or maybe having spent time in a mental institution. And I think you're pointing to a really significant matter here. So I have wondered at times about a variety of people, not simply homeless, but other people that I've known as well, who found it difficult to establish permanent work, who were unable to really find a place within the society that worked well for them. And I thought about how in the Middle Ages, up into the modern period, those societies were in many ways, quite rigid from a modern perspective. That is, there were very particular roles. There were people who were in positions of authority, kings and princes and what have you. They had their military class, but often their military class was drawn together from other princes or lords or what have you that were in liege to them. You had the priestly class, and you also, of course, had farmers, and you had people working in various trades. You had carpenters and blacksmiths, people that could shoe horses and things of that nature. Now, often when we think of the medieval period, we see it as being, um, in terms of the ability to move from one kind of work to another. That wasn't very common. These were pretty stable segments of the society, pretty stable classes within the society. There was some movement, perhaps, but not a lot. So if your father was a shoemaker or a carpenter or a farmer, the chances were large that children would also, and this often meant boy children, would often become part of that way of working and making their way in the world. Occasionally, a son would be taken to a monastery, would get a theological education, and would become a priest. We see this stability. This stability lasted a long time in parts of Canada. I mean, if you look at Quebec, up until 1960, it was also a very traditional society in which that kind of stable class shaped it. What we also find in the medieval period is, because there were monasteries, and monasteries are this exceptional institution where people could go to them, and they could go and seek hospitality, they could go and seek shelter and safety. And many monasteries had ways of caring for the poor within their region. Many monasteries had hospitals and leprosariums associated with them for people that had really, really serious illness, and they provided for them. So the social service network, if you will, of much of the ancient world and the medieval world was provided by religious institutions. You also had wandering friars and wandering mendicants, people who, at least I suspect, you referred to the mental health challenges of street people. Well, those mental health challenges have always existed in society. I expect that in the medieval period, a lot of people that had mental health challenges, they would find that they could live better in monasteries or live better by joining in small bands of wanderers, of people that didn't have their roots in a particular place. Now, these are of two kinds. One of them, of course, are villains, groups of villains, brigands, or people that are living outside the law, people that are living in the wild, and they might engage in thievery,
mm-hmm.
in paying attention to the roads where travelers are and make their living that way. The other group is wandering people that identify with a particular kind of religious life and order. And they would also, I expect, many of them also had the kind of mental health challenges that you speak of. In Greek, we have a name for them. We talk about them as idiorhythmic. And in English, we get the word idiot from this. But its Greek word means a person whose rhythms of their life are very much their own. Their rhythms are not determined by any other larger part of the society. I've also known some young people that got into real difficulties with drugs and who had difficulty finding their way. And I've often thought, it would be so much better if we had a local monastery or some local monasteries where you would have a very definite order to life. You would have a number of people that that would love someone who came, even if they came just for a season. There would be hard work to do, and they could do some of that work. And there would be the cycle of prayer, and there would be an understanding of the human condition and the struggles of human beings. And there would be disciplined forms of love and affection, where you would practice a little bit of tough love with some of them. I recall in the rule of Saint Benedict, the great rule for the Western monastic world, it says if somebody is in the monastery and doesn't understand what's going on here, let 3 stout monks take him outside and explain it to him. So this was Benedict's way of saying sometimes you need vigorous discipline. You need to help people understand what's going on and what's required of them. But the fact that these institutions had a teaching about hospitality, had a teaching about the rhythm of life, 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of prayer. This I'm sure worked for a lot of people and made their life an awful lot better than it would otherwise be. And the mendicants as well, the people that were wanderers, they also became known. They would be known from the villages that they came from, the towns they came from, and they would be known as having a very particular kind of pilgrimage, a very particular kind of spiritual sojourn. So they wouldn't be considered obsolete to the society. They wouldn't be considered as trash. They wouldn't be considered as simply mentally ill, so you ignore them. They would be as best they could in that world. They had a kind of status. It's a status that's ambiguous, that we don't understand, but they're all seen as spiritual pilgrims like all the rest of us in the world, with a particular kind of rhythm. So they would be given shelter at times, they would be given food, and of course in the medieval world and in much of Asia, if you take Buddhist monasticism, certainly in the Theravada Buddhist tradition, it has a tradition of monks going house to house, people coming out at particular times of the day because monks would process by, and giving a few grains of rice into their baking bowl. There was a culture of recognition that these folks are listening to a different drummer, that you're not likely going to be able to have them do anything else. So it became part of the culture to care for them in very modest ways. Everybody gives a little bit, and it makes life much more feasible for them. So I've often thought with street people, I've often wondered if in the medieval period or in other kinds of societies, if their life wouldn't be a lot easier, because there were ways of understanding within those cultures and those religious worlds that you have certain amount of people, men and women, who for a whole range of reasons are unable to live in terms of the normal stable patterns. They are in a sense pilgrims. They are people in search, and we need to do what we can to be gentle with them and to do the bit we can to care for them.
But continuing on with this theme, working with the homeless population, I also realized they do form their own cliques, like what we were saying there in our conversation. I mean, they could be just kind of like little socialist cliques or communal cliques. Some of them are gangs, but it is what it is. They do look after each other's interests. But also, you can see in other ways, people who are marginalized or people who are simply different. If you look at MC culture or motorcycle culture, there's legitimate groups that aren't criminal, but they form their own little private societies. So, I mean, you can kind of see this line of thought, like not everyone fits in our society, and do they really need to?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's ways for people to function in their own groups and still add to society.
Mm-hmm. Well, most gangs, I mean, it is interesting suggestion. I mean, when you look at motorcycle gangs, they
Or regular MC groups.
they all have, yeah, other kinds of gangs. Uh, they all have their own colors. They all have their own ways of identifying themselves. In a sense, they're all wearing vestments,
Mm-hmm.
or they're wearing particular kinds of garments of attachment. And it's the case also, of course, with monastics and the religious world. This is a form of belonging, and we know a lot about gangs, that gangs develop in contexts where there's been a lot of alienation, a lot of marginalization, and so then certain groups of people become attached to each other. They
Mm-hmm.
find a place to belong. They find their own little church, if you will.
Good argument.
And they then of course have their own mores. They have their own forms of initiation. This all sounds like religion to me. They have uh, expectations. Of course, the real issue here is what is the aspiration that's working here, and how does it come about that some people gather together and belong for the sake of the love of God, for the sake of the service to others, including the service to those that do not belong, those that are marginalized? And how does it come about that some form their own groups and become attached and they belong, and they do it simply out of whatever the leadership says is the ideal? And that may, in fact, even be criminal. So, my sense is when you look at our society, there's a lot of these kind of fraternal groups in our society, a lot of ways that people can belong to different organizations, and those organizations reflect how they think of themselves and what their social status is. So if you look at any country club, you could think of that country club as its own kind of network of belonging. And it has its own social mores, and it's usually a particular economic group. And they have their aspirations. I think there's much less difference. This may sound ridiculous, but I think there's much less difference between those that belong to country clubs and those that belong to gangs.
Mm-hmm.
They both of them usually reflect a particular segment of our economic society, and they have mores and aspirations which are deeply dictated by that particular economic station. That is true of gangs. Gangs are also kind of enslaved to a particular kind of economic station, and it usually has a lot to do with poverty. But it's also true of the wealthy who gather in that sort of way. And in both cases, the tragedy is they're living in a world in which there is little room for understanding of real service, understanding of modesty and humility, and where the belonging is not simply a belonging to those who are like-minded, to those who are in a similar difficulty. It's the wonderful thing about the church, in my view, at its best, when it's healthy, that this is a form of belonging which isn't understood to be belonging to your own self-interest. It is to belong to the servant of the whole of the human family that calls you to give of yourself, to make room for others, and to see that everyone you meet is blessed, and to work for their healing.